Okay, so the first item on the rack is the external power pack for the mixing desk. Just two buttons on here, main power and the phantom power switch. Phantom power will be used when you're using condenser mics on your live sound gear for things such as drum mic overheads, or if you've got a little condenser mic that you point directly at the hi-hat. If you're in a larger venue, you may want to do that because hi-hats won't be picked up that much by an overhead mic. You may get some spill into the snare mic, but generally speaking, in a larger venue, when you do want to hear that hi-hat, then you'll put a direct condenser mic onto it. So that's what the phantom power is for. Each channel on my desk does have its own individual phantom power switch, so it can be turned on solely on the channels that need the phantom power. You can get some cheaper desks which will have one switch on it for phantom power, which will apply the phantom power to all channels. With those, you do have to be careful how you do your connections, because if you supply phantom power to a microphone that doesn't need it, you can damage the microphone. So that's why I prefer my desk, because it has the individual power for each channel. Moving down, we have a matched pair of Samson S-Curve 231 dual 31 band graphic equalizers. Switch them on so you can see the lights. As you can see, I've got these ramped full up all the way. Now I use these for my monitors, to EQ the monitors. The reason they're all ramped up at full whack is because they have a cut only feature switched on here, which means I can just pull a frequency where it's feeding back. We also have a low cut feature, which means you can actually cut completely out of the mix any frequencies below a certain level. This is usually for things like rumble, or if all you're feeding into the mix is vocals, you don't need certain frequencies below a certain level for vocals, because vocals don't produce that. Normally you'd be looking somewhere around about maybe the 40 to 50 hertz range. Anything below that is cut completely out of the mix. But it is adjustable all the way from 15 hertz all the way up to 200 hertz. I've never really known to get rumble or feedback at that sort of frequency, but it does make the vocals clearer in a monitor mix if you cut out the lower frequencies. We also have a range button, either 6 dB, or if it's out, it's 12 dB. This denotes how much each one of these notches cuts the signal down by. I like to use it on the 6 dB button because it gives you a slightly finer control of how much you are cutting that particular frequency down by. And the last button on here is the equalizer in or out button. So as you can see, I've switched it on, all the lights come on. That means the equalizer is active, and any changes I make here will affect the sound coming out of the monitors. Switch it out, the lights go off, the equalizer is inactive, the signal chain is bypassing the EQ and going straight to the monitor wedges. So this lets you then, the artist on stage, have a direct comparison listen between non-EQ'd and EQ'd sound. Normally, if you've EQ'd the wedges to the point of no feedback and you switch the equalizer off again, you'll probably get some squealing feedback from the monitor wedges. Switch it back on, EQ gone. If you need to kill the monitors on stage for any reason, easiest way to do it is pull the channel level right down to off, and that will kill all the signal going through the monitors. But, there we go. So that is basically the monitors EQs. Okay, so the next items in the rack are the effects units. As you can see, my first two are a matched pair, and then I've got a later version of effectively the same unit. The first two I use for my vocal effects, so switch them on. As you can see, one is program 8 and one is program 29. So that's my reverb effect, and that is my delay effect, which I will use solely on vocals. The actual length of those effects is adjustable. using your programs and your dials, so you can adjust how much reverb and how much delay you want for the particular venue you're in. Larger venues may not require as much because you will have a natural reverb and delay within the venue. Smaller venues like small pubs or clubs, you may want to use more to create the effect of a large hall. Okay, so that's those two. The third one, this is one that I use in conjunction with another effect further down the rack, and this I use for a gated reverb for use on snare drums, just to give that punchy snap with a tiny little bit of overring on a snare drum, the sort of sound that you'll hear on traditional AOR rock tracks. If you go back and listen to something like Here I Go Again by Whitesnake, they'll have used the gated reverb on the snare. So that's basically my effects units, what they're for and where I use them. Okay, so the next three items in the rack are all basically the same type of product, just varying ages of the units. So the first one is the 1600, then the 2100, then the 2200, basically as the manufacturer progressed through making the product better and better. They're all compressors or limiters or gates, depending on what you want to call them and how they're being utilised. So they're three stereo compressors that I have, which basically gives me 6 channels of compression to be used as inserts on the desk on whatever I want to use them on. Primarily these would be used on your subgroups, so you could have overall compression on, say, a vocal subgroup, one for keyboards, one for guitars, one for basses, one for drums, and then if you've got an extra percussion section or a brass section, you may want to use compression on that channel as well. So you've obviously got your threshold, you've got your attack, your release, your output, so you can actually increase the output. If your compression is quite heavy, you can increase the output so that your output is at a similar volume level or amplitude level to your input as well. They all basically do the same job. Some have got more features than the previous versions, but effectively they're all just compressors. If you want to know more about compression, there's plenty of videos on YouTube that tell you how a compressor works and how to set up a compressor for basic use. But that's basically what those 3 effects units are. They're just 3 stereo compressors to use as inserts. Okay, so the next 2 items in the rack are my quad noise gates, which basically gives me 8 channels of gating. Switch them on so you can see lots of fairy lights, looks good in the dark. Each one will create a gate which will stop the signal being processed through to the front of house speakers. If the incoming signal is too low, the gate will close, the signal chain will be cut, and nothing from that input source will be fed through to the outgoing speakers. Once it reaches the threshold level, the gate is opened, the signal is allowed to pass through. Use these primarily on the drums. They do have what's called a side chain input on each channel of the gate. This is where I input that gated reverb that I mentioned earlier in for the snare drum channel, just to give the snare drum a bit of extra reverb, just to expand it out a little bit. But that's basically what these 2 units do. They're noise gates. Okay, so the last 2 items in the rack, and one of them is probably the most important piece on the entire system, are my front of house graphic equalizer and my crossover, which I'll just switch on. Okay, so as you can see, like the S curves that I've got at the top of the rack, they're 31 bands per channel. Again, like the ones at the top, they have a 6 dB or 12 dB range for fine or coarse adjustment of each frequency that you want to cut or boost. We have the IO meter switch, which allows this to actively, while there is sound being processed through it, let you know where frequencies are dancing around on the system. We also have the audio in-out button as the one at the top, which basically allows you to switch the EQ in or switch the EQ out, so you can do direct comparison listen when you are EQing the room. This is the first piece of audio processing equipment that the sound from your desk will hit before it goes to your speakers as a direct signal out from the desk. From here it gets fed into the crossover. This is probably the single most important part of the system, because this determines what signals are being fed to what speakers in your system on stage. This particular one can be used either in stereo, in which case it runs a two-way speaker split system, or if it's used as a mono one, it can be run three ways, so that would be for a tri-amp system, which we would use for subs, mids and tops. This particular one is being run in stereo because my mids and top cabs are a combined unit, so I have a bi-amp system or 2-amp system in my setup. As you can see, we've got 4 mute buttons for left and right, and those are for your highs and lows on each channel. I do have a separate CD that I have loaded with just pink noise, which I use for signal chain check. So I individually, one at a time, unmute the channels on the crossover to make sure that the correct signal is being sent to the correct speaker. The reason I use a CD with just pink noise on it is pink noise creates the entire frequency range at an equal level across all frequencies. So it allows me to perfectly check that the correct frequencies are being sent to the correct speakers. From here it goes down the multi-core to the stage and fed into the amplifiers, which I will go into on another video. We have our crossover frequency, which allows us to determine at which point in the frequency range the signal is split between your bass speakers and the rest of your system. And you also have gain or cuts, depending on how you want to do this, for your highs and lows. So you may want to slightly boost your lows and slightly cut your highs, because high frequencies have a tendency to travel further and sound louder. So you may want to cut the output of your high frequencies but boost your low frequencies. Throughout the evening, as bodies in the room fill up, you may want to increase your high output because the human body tends to absorb the higher frequencies. So those standing further away from the sound source will hear more bass frequency than top end frequency. But that's basically what the crossover does. And why I use an EQ down here as well. Okay, just as an additional, this is a rack with just 1 or 2 extra spare effects that I carry, just in case anything in my main rack fails during the course of an evening. So I have a spare graphic equalizer, I have a spare effects unit, and most importantly, I carry a spare crossover. Like all the other effects units, this is dual 31 band. Like the other effects units, it has an in-out switch, so I can do a direct comparison listen using this. If an EQ does fail, I will tend to copy the curve of the faders from the one that's failed onto this, so that when I plug this in line, it has exactly the same audio signal output that the previous EQ used. This effects unit, multi-effects, can be used to replace any one of the 3 should any one of those 3 fail. And again, crossover, like before, most important part of the system, and this can be instantly swapped over on my system should my other crossover fail. This is why I carry these 3. You may be asking why I don't carry spare compressors or noise gates. Those can be lived without. Should one of them fail, you can just bypass the signal and run without that compressor or that noise gate for the rest of your event, giving you time between events to get it repaired or replaced. But these are the 3 important parts of the spares that I carry. Carry these in a separate rack case, instantly accessible should I need to plug in from the original rack into this rack, and get running again.